Hi, my name's Sam Marshall. I'm a senior developer at the Open University, and I want to talk about developing plugin support for the mobile app. That's how you build and test a custom module, for example. So first, the developer system. What do you have to install on your computer in order to do this? Second, how the app works. Third, how a module plugin works within the app. And finally, behat testing of that plugin. So the developer system, you're going to need to set up some things in your PC in order that you can create a plugin for the mobile app, or take your existing plugin and make it work in the mobile app. You need a Moodle development environment, which you've probably got already, and you're going to need to configure your developer server so that it enables the mobile app. Then you'll be able to connect to it and test with real devices, so the mobile app on your phone. And I recommend that you should also use a debug build of the desktop app. So here's what it looks like, the desktop app in debug mode. You get the app on the left, which is kind of like Android, and you get developer tools on the right, which are the same as in Chrome. There's also a device simulation option, which you can sometimes use if you need it. And this is really convenient to use for developing the app on your computer. It's not distributed, so you have to build it yourself, or if you happen to want one for Windows, you can download one I made. How does the Moodle app work? It's built on 3 frameworks. Cordova lets you make an app in HTML and JavaScript, single page app, and then it will run on Android and iOS so that we don't have to write separate native apps for each platform. Ionic is a HTML and JavaScript based interface that looks like native app components. There's some examples over on the right there. And Angular is a framework for writing JavaScript, but you don't quite use JavaScript. There's a source code called TypeScript that's compiled to JavaScript, which would be fine. You can't do that inside a plugin. We'll come back to that later. So the app is a single page app, and that means the whole thing is just one web page. And even when it looks like you're going to another page, that's actually something being added and removed within that one web page. And one consequence of this is that higher level pages, the ones that you can go back to, remain in the DOM underneath the current page. So when you go back, it just kind of removes the current page and you see what's underneath. So the app communicates with the Moodle server to do everything. So when you log into the server, after you've typed in the server address, you'll need to log in with your username and password. The server will check the password and create a token for you. That's, by default, it lasts for 90 days. Then everything else the app does is authenticated using that token, and it's done just by calling a standard Moodle web services on the Moodle server. So there's loads of web services it uses. So for example, the list of app courses on the front page of the app for the user is a Get Enrolled Courses web service. If you were to, from within a course, if you tick one of the completion progress tick boxes, that will call a web service to update it, and so on. How do plugins work within the app, particularly activity module plugins? There's official documentation, which is actually pretty good, so definitely you're going to need to refer to that a lot. The plugin support does work with a web service, like I just mentioned, but the good news is you don't have to write the web service yourself. There's already a standard one, and it'll automatically call functions in your code. And it will provide arguments that, as a Moodle developer, you'll be familiar with, like the course module ID. And your code returns data to display in the app, so that's HTML, basically, a template, and JavaScript code and data. In order to indicate that your plugin supports the app, you need to create a db/mobile.php file. Here's one for an activity module of ours. I'm just going to go through this sort of from the top. So number one, you've got a $addons array, and then first we start with the component name as a key. So that's what our module is called. And then inside that there's an array of handlers. Normally you only need one handler. Each handler has an arbitrary name. You can make up what you like. Within that, you specify a delegate, and we're using core course module delegate. There's a number of these that are available, and they control where it connects into the app, so when the app calls into your plugin. So if you use this one, then it's for a activity module, and your plugin is going to get called if someone clicks on the activity in a course. And there's display data, which for a course module is the icon, and you just pass the full URL of an icon for your activity. It doesn't use the Moodle theme. And a class name, which is just a CSS class that will stick on the app in case you need to style it. Then there's a method, and this is the name of the function, which can be anything. I've called mine mobile document view, and that gets called when the user is viewing your activity. Then there's an array of styles where you've got a URL, and that's the full path again to a CSS file. Now I've got a PHP script because I needed to mess about with it a bit, but you can probably most of the time just link directly to a CSS file. There's also a version number, and you have to change that if you change the CSS file. It's the version just for the CSS. And finally, there's an init function in here, and that function is another second function that's called when the app starts. So not when they click the thing, but when the app starts. Finally, there's an array of language strings, and you can include language strings from your plugin, like I've got 2 from this plugin here, and also from other plugins, if you like, that are needed for your plugin to work within the app. So there are 2 handler functions that I showed there. They're both called by the app via a web service. That's a core web service you don't have to write. And they call functions in a class that you have to create in classes/output/mobile.php within your plugin. So when the app starts up, it will call the init function. And that function normally just returns some JavaScript code. And that can do things like define functions to be called by the other one. Or it could set up things that apply globally throughout the app, such as things to do with working out where links go. Then the other function is called when the user clicks on your activity. So then there's this method function. And that function is basically the same as the view.php that you're probably familiar with for the web version of your module. So it's the main thing that displays stuff to the user. So it returns an HTML template, which is actually an Angular template, containing the content of the page, some JavaScript data, and some JavaScript code. So I'll just explain a little bit about those templates I mentioned. You would normally use a mustache template, which you're probably familiar with as a Moodle developer, to write the output. And that output can just be plain HTML, although you should probably use some Ionic tags to create components that look like they're part of the mobile app. But it's actually an Angular template, which means that within that output you can use Angular things like there's an attribute star ngIf, which can conditionally have part of it display or not display based on some of that JavaScript data, which can obviously change. The Angular template changes immediately if the JavaScript data changes. So if you had something with ngIf and you change the data, it may suddenly appear on screen or disappear. The mustache template obviously only runs on the server, so it only happens when it's downloading to the user. And it's basically up to you how much you want to use the Angular bit and how much you just stick with the mustache bit that's calculated once on the server, or you kind of do a mix of both. In Angular, normally you would code a component to go on screen, and you do that by writing a class in a TypeScript file and it will get compiled. You can't do any of that in a plugin. The JavaScript that you return is just a chunk of inline JavaScript code. This variable refers to a component that's owned by the Moodle app, and you can add functions to it like I've done there, and then you can refer to them from the Angular template using things like that brackets click attribute there. So that's how you make a button where when you click it, it will call your JavaScript function, and then you could obviously do something in the function. This variable also has lots and lots of useful stuff in it. That's how you can refer to all of the other app components. So if you needed to do something like, for example, open a URL in the system browser or something like that, you can do that by calling various things from this. And if you use a debugger, you can see what's available, and it's also useful to look at the source code for the actual app. Now, what if you've already written some JavaScript for your web version of your module and you want to maybe reuse it in the app? So you might have, for example, made a drag and drop question and it's got a lot of JavaScript. Well, great news, you can't reuse it. There's no jQuery in the app, there's no AMD module support, and the DOM structure of the app is going to be different. So you're going to have to re-implement it by hand. The good news is there is modern JavaScript available, so you don't need jQuery because it won't support old browsers. And you should probably, when you're doing this, use the original code as a basis, because that way, well, probably when you wrote the original code, you wrote it with a bunch of bugs, which you have since fixed. And if you use that as a basis, you can maybe avoid creating the same bugs again. Here are some general tips. When you're using the debug version of the desktop app, it's really easy to restart the app. You just click in the right-hand area and then press F5. One of the things that's difficult is using the debugger within the app, but because it's difficult to find the source code for the stuff you've written because it's inline. But if you just stick the debugger keyword into JavaScript, then the browser will automatically break out at that point. If you're writing any CSS changes, it's best to try them out in the developer tools before you try and put them in your CSS file, because it's basically tedious to change. Finally, the app caches web service calls. So if that's happening to you, you'll notice it does log something on the debug console, and the cache lasts 5 minutes. So if you get confused because something's not updating, that might be why. How to apply some changes. If you've changed a moustache template, then all you have to do is refresh the page. Just pull it down from the top and it will load again with a new template. If you've changed the page JavaScript, again, all you have to do is refresh the page. If you've changed the init JavaScript that runs when the app starts, then obviously you have to restart the app, and then you'll have to navigate back to wherever your plugin is. If you've changed the CSS file, you've got to update the version number in db/mobile.php, you've got to purge caches on the server, you've got to restart the app, and then you've got to navigate back where you were. So that one's a bit tedious. Now this is a bit I really wanted to talk about because I've, together with some very helpful people from the Moodle HQ developers, I've built the Behat testing support for the mobile app into Moodle 3.7. So just in case, I kind of hope you do know what Behat testing is, but maybe some of you don't. It's automated functional testing using a browser. So it simulates a person doing things like clicking on buttons, typing on text and looking at the result. And it's been used for years in Moodle development. It's particularly important with mobile app plugins, and the reason for that is the mobile app gets updated every few months, and that update might possibly break something that you've done for your plugin, and you can't control the timing of the updates because it just gets updated to the app stores. So you really ought to be testing against every version of the app before it's released, and if you did that manually, it would be really boring. So there's documentation on the wiki for writing Behat tests for your mobile app. You're going to need a Moodle app installation on your computer. You can use Docker, it's in the instructions above, but if for some reason that isn't going to work for you, then you have to install an app development environment, and there's instructions on the wiki. It is quite difficult. How it works, this is pretty much the same as normal Behat testing. The app will appear in a Chrome browser window. There are some things you can't test in this, like device features such as a camera, and differences between iOS and Android because it mostly appears like Android. When you're writing a test, you start by setting up Moodle exactly the same as in any other Behat test. So you might need to create a course, create a user, maybe some activities. Then you go into the app and do some testing, like press some buttons and check something works. There are some special steps you need to use for testing the app. The main one is I enter the app, which is what starts the app. But then many of the standard steps, like click on something, don't work very well because of the thing I mentioned about the previous pages still being there in the DOM. They don't work very well for that reason. So there are some new steps which are really easy to use. So I press a word in the app. That will press on a button, text or image that has that word in. It's quite clever. It will do exact matches in preference to partial matches and things. But if there's multiple instances of the same thing, you might need to use I press X near Y in the app, and then it will look around in the DOM tree and find the Y text, which is hopefully unique, and then it will find the nearest X to that one and press that. And there are some other steps like that. This is an example Behat test. It's very short, but it is a real one. It does work. I'm going to go through it starting from the top. There are two tags, @app and @JavaScript, that you're going to need in every app test. If you don't include those, it won't work. Going down a bit further to the background, this is the part that's the same as any Moodle Behat test. So you can see I've created a course, I've created a user called Student1, and I've enrolled them on the course. Next, number 2, when I enter the app. So that will start the app, and the app will automatically connect to the Moodle server that's running the Behat test. Then, and I log in as Student1. That's the normal login step, but it works for the app login page as well. Number 4, and I press Course 1 near Course Overview in the app. That's going to select the right version of Course 1 on the screen and click on it. And finally, the actual test part of this, we're going to check that you do end up in the page called Course 1 using the header should be Course 1 in the app step. This is the test pretending to run right now. So when you start the test, it looks like any other Moodle test. You see the ordinary size web browser window and your ordinary Moodle site. This stays there while it's running the background steps. Then when you do and I enter the app, it switches to this kind of size, and you'll see the Moodle app start up and it will connect to your website. Then, and I log in as Student1, it will type in the username and password and it will click the login button. Then I press Course 1 near Course Overview. It's actually helpfully slightly off the screen in this screenshot, but there is a word Course 1 there where it's clicking on to get to the course. And finally it checks that the header should be course 1 in the app, so the header is the orange stripe at the top, and it does say course 1, so the test has passed. So just to summarise what we've seen here, you can make custom modules and some other plugin types work in the Moodle mobile app, and to make it easier to test your plugin against future app versions, you should create an automated behat test for it. That's the end of this talk. Thank you for listening.